On a grey morning in late November 1942, a Luftwaffe ace named Egon Mayer climbed into his Focke-Wulf 190 at an airfield near Brest on the coast of occupied France. He had 55 aerial victories to his name. He had downed Spitfires over England, Hurricanes over the Channel, and Yak fighters over Russia. He was one of the most decorated fighter pilots in the German Air Force, a man whose instincts had kept him alive through 3 years of the most dangerous flying in history. His mechanics watched him taxi onto the runway with the quiet confidence of professionals who had seen their pilot return from missions that killed everyone else. They expected him back for lunch. What Mayer did not know as his engine roared to full power was that somewhere over the Bay of Biscay, 90 American B-17 flying fortresses were approaching from the west, escorted by nothing. The Americans were flying without fighter cover because no Allied fighter in existence could escort bombers all the way from England to southern France and back. German fighter controllers knew this. Mayer knew this. The mission looked, on paper, exactly like the dozens of interceptions he had already executed against unescorted bombers. It looked like a routine kill. Within 30 minutes, after attacking one of those formations, Mayer would land back at Brest and file a report that his superiors found so alarming they classified it immediately. He had discovered something about the American bombers that nobody in German high command had taken seriously. Not because they lacked the intelligence. Because they had refused to believe it. Germany entered the air war against the United States with a set of assumptions built from 2 years of fighting the British Royal Air Force. The RAF flew Spitfires and Hurricanes, superbly designed fighters that rewarded individual skill and aggression. British bomber crews were disciplined but orthodox. Their formations could be broken up by aggressive head-on attacks or by diving through the formation at high speed, scattering the aircraft and destroying the mutual defense that bombers in close formation depended on. The RAF had rules. German pilots had learned those rules and written countermoves for each of them, like a chess grandmaster who has memorized every opening his opponent knows. When American forces began arriving in England in the summer of 1942, German intelligence looked at the equipment and drew the obvious conclusion. The Americans flew the same aircraft. They trained on similar doctrine. They were, in the estimation of Luftwaffe Fighter Command, simply British pilots who spoke with different accents. This assumption was catastrophically wrong. Not because American pilots were better trained or more skilled. In 1942 many of them were neither. It was wrong because of something the Germans had not measured and had not thought to measure. Something about the way American bombers were armed, how their crews talked to each other, and how they died when they were hit. It was wrong because of the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, and what happened inside one when the gun started firing. The B-17 was not the fastest bomber of the war. It was not the heaviest. It could not carry the bomb loads of the British Lancaster, nor did it fly as high as some of its contemporaries. What it could do was absorb punishment on a scale that Luftwaffe pilots found almost incomprehensible. The aircraft carried 13.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns mounted in 11 positions covering virtually every arc of approach. The weapons themselves were extraordinary. The M2 Browning fired at 750 to 850 rounds per minute with a muzzle velocity of nearly 2,900 feet per second. At the ranges where aerial combat took place, a single hit from a .50 caliber round could tear through an aircraft engine, shatter a cockpit canopy, or ignite fuel lines. But the gun was not what made the B-17 dangerous. It was the way the guns were coordinated. American bomber crews trained obsessively on formation gunnery, the discipline of firing not as individuals but as a collective, concentrating fire from multiple aircraft on a single attacking fighter. When 10 B-17s flew in tight formation and an attacking aircraft crossed through their combined fields of fire, it was not engaging one bomber. It was engaging a flying artillery position capable of directing perhaps 40.50 caliber rounds per second at a single point in space. Egon Mayer understood this in the abstract before November 1942. He did not understand it in practice until a BA-17 gunner put a burst through the engine cowling of his Focke-Wulf from a range of 600 meters, and he spent the next 4 minutes nursing a wounded fighter back to the coast, wondering why the Americans had shot at him before he was close enough to shoot back. The Americans were firing at distances German doctrine considered a waste of ammunition. They were right and German doctrine was wrong, and the gap between those two facts would cost the Luftwaffe irreplaceable pilots before it understood what it was actually facing. What Mayer filed in his report that November afternoon became the foundation of a tactical revolution in German fighter operations. He concluded that the standard attack profile used against British bombers, diving through the formation from above and behind, was suicidal against B-17s. The tail guns, the waist guns, the top turret, and the ball turret all had clear fields of fire against a conventional pursuit curve attack. Any fighter approaching from behind would spend 30 or 40 seconds inside the defensive envelope before reaching firing range, and a Focke-Wulf that spent 30 seconds inside the defensive envelope of a Type B-17 formation would arrive at the firing position with cannon shells in its engine and its pilot slumped forward over the controls. Mayer proposed a solution that became known as the 12 o'clock high attack, a frontal assault at the same altitude as the bombers, closing at a combined speed of 500 to 600 miles per hour, giving both the attacking pilot and the bomber's nose gunner roughly 2 seconds of firing time before the fighter had to break away to avoid collision. The frontal attack concentrated the closing speed on the problem of mutual fire. At those velocities, the bomber's nose gunner had almost no time to track and engage. The fighter pilot had almost no time to aim. Whoever was more accurate in 2 seconds lived. The tactic worked well enough that Mayer scored 18 kills against American bombers using it before he himself was shot down and killed in March 1944 over Montmedy, France, by a P-47 escort fighter that had finally been given enough fuel to follow the bombers all the way to the target. He was 29 years old. He died as a consequence of the same industrial logic he had been fighting since November 1942. The Americans had simply built more fighters and eventually given them bigger fuel tanks. The story of American air power in the European theater is not a story of superior pilots. In the early years, it is frequently a story of inferior pilots flying into slaughter with remarkable persistence. The 8th Air Force's first major strategic bombing missions in 1942 and early 1943 produced loss rates that, had they continued, would have mathematically destroyed the entire force within a few months. On October 14, 1943, a day that bomber crews called Black Thursday, 291 B-17s took off for the Schweinfurt ball-bearing plants deep in Germany without fighter escort. 60 of them did not come back. Another 121 sustained damage serious enough that they were effectively out of action. More than 600 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured in a single afternoon. By any reasonable military calculation, missions at that loss rate had to stop. They did stop. And then, because American industry was by that point producing aircraft faster than German flak and fighters could destroy them, and because American training pipelines were producing pilots faster than they could be killed, they started again. The Luftwaffe shot down 60 bombers on October 14, 1943. American factories built more than 100 B-17s and B-24s every day for most of that year. The arithmetic was not complicated. It was simply unbearable, if you were on the German side. What the Luftwaffe could not match was not just production. It was the system behind production, the invisible infrastructure of American industrial power that connected aluminum smelters in Washington state to assembly lines in Seattle to training fields in Texas to airfields in England to targets over Germany in a chain so vast and so integrated that attacking any single link barely slowed the whole. General Adolf Galland, Germany's general of fighters, understood this by 1943 with a clarity that left him sleepless. Galland was perhaps the finest fighter leader Germany produced, a man of genuine tactical brilliance who had scored 104 aerial victories and commanded every fighter pilot in the Luftwaffe. He submitted a memorandum to Hermann Göring in late 1943 that amounted to a formal warning that Germany was losing the air war, not because its pilots were inferior, but because the Americans were replacing their losses faster than the Luftwaffe could inflict them. Göring's response, according to Galland's post-war memoir, was to accuse him of cowardice, demand that he produce more victories from pilots who were already dying faster than they could be trained, and threaten him with demotion. The conversation illustrated everything wrong with German strategic thinking. The man responsible for the air war refused to acknowledge the terms on which it was actually being fought. He measured success in aircraft shot down. The Americans measured success in aircraft remaining after the shooting stopped. Those are not the same calculation, and Germany was losing both. The men who flew the missions understood something that statistics do not capture cleanly. American bomber crews in 1943 flew knowing that the mathematical odds of completing a standard 25-mission tour of duty were somewhere between desperate and impossible. Early analysis suggested that the average crew could expect to be shot down around mission 14 or 15. The Air Force did not advertise this number. The crews calculated it themselves from watching men they knew fail to return from missions over Bremen and Wilhelmshaven and Regensburg. Technical Sergeant Forrest Vossler flew as a radio operator and gunner on a B-17 named Jersey Bounce Jr. on December 20, 1943, on a mission to Bremen. His aircraft was hit by cannon fire from attacking fighters. The blast destroyed the radio equipment he was operating and drove metal fragments into both of his eyes and his face. He was functionally blind. The aircraft was still flying. His crew needed the radio to call for help and for navigation. Vossler, operating by touch and by the memory of equipment he knew better than his own hands, repaired the radio under fire while blind. When the aircraft ditched in the North Sea after the crew discovered that a fellow crew member had been blown partially out of a hatch and was hanging outside the aircraft, Vossler helped hold the man in place during the crash landing and then pulled him clear of the sinking wreckage in the water. He did this while blind. He received the Medal of Honor. Stories like Vossler's appear with frequency in the records of the 8th Air Force because the missions that produced them occurred constantly, repeatedly, all winter long, while the debate raged in London and Washington about whether daylight strategic bombing could actually work. The crews who were dying in those debates had reached their own conclusions. They kept flying anyway. The Luftwaffe pilots who opposed them arrived at a different and equally uncomfortable conclusion. They were killing Americans faster than they had killed any other enemy. And it was not enough. Oberleutnant Anton Haeckel flew fighters in the defense of the Rhine from 1942 through the end of the war. He scored 192 aerial victories, a number that places him among the highest-scoring aces in history, and the vast majority of those kills came against American aircraft. Haeckel survived the war, which alone distinguished him from most of his contemporaries, and in post-war interviews he returned repeatedly to a single observation that framed his entire experience. He had shot down American aircraft in such numbers that he would have been considered a legend in any other air force. And yet the Americans kept coming. Every morning the radar screens lit up with formations that were larger than the ones he had engaged the week before. Every week the escort fighters flew a little farther, stayed a little longer, arrived with a little more fuel. Haeckel understood what Galland had told Göring and Göring had refused to hear. Germany was not fighting American pilots. Germany was fighting American production. And German pilots, however skilled, however brave, however willing to die, were not built in factories. The P-51 Mustang changed the calculation in ways that German Fighter Command had known were coming for more than a year before they arrived. The aircraft had existed in prototype form since 1940, designed by North American Aviation for the British government and initially powered by an Allison engine that gave it excellent low-altitude performance but mediocre capability at the altitudes where strategic bombers flew. A British engineer named Ronald Harker flew the prototype in April 1942 and recognized immediately that the airframe was extraordinary. The problem was the engine. He proposed fitting the aircraft with the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the engine that powered the Spitfire. The British Air Ministry was skeptical. North American Aviation was not. American engineers built 5 prototypes with Merlin engines in 117 days, a timeline that British aviation authorities considered impossible and American engineers considered Tuesday. The result was an aircraft that combined the P-51's exceptional aerodynamics with the Merlin's high-altitude performance to produce a fighter that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and fight its way home afterward. Range in an escort-configured P-51D reached 1,650 miles with drop tanks. The distance from England to Berlin is roughly 580 miles each way. The math worked. For the first time in the air war, American bombers had a fighter that could stay with them all the way to the target and cover their return. The first P-51B escort missions over Germany occurred in December 1943. The effect on Luftwaffe fighter pilots was immediate and documented. They had built their tactics around the certainty that American fighters would eventually have to turn back. They had learned to wait out the escorts, then attack the bombers once the protective fighters turned for home. The P-51 destroyed this assumption completely. There was no point at which the escort turned back. German pilots who climbed to intercept formations over Hanover found Mustangs climbing to meet them. Pilots who dived away to escape found Mustangs diving faster. Pilots who attempted to disengage and land to refuel found Mustangs following them down to strafe their airfields. General Jimmy Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force, issued an order in early 1944 that redefined American air strategy with a directness that made German commanders profoundly uncomfortable. He told his fighter pilots to hunt German aircraft wherever they could be found, including on the ground. The P-51s were no longer there only to protect bombers. They were there to destroy the Luftwaffe as an institution. February 1944, which American air commanders called Big Week, saw more than 3,300 American bomber sorties over German aircraft production facilities while P-51 escorts ranged ahead of the formations actively seeking Luftwaffe fighters rather than waiting to be attacked. German pilots who had accumulated 50, 60, 100 aerial victories found themselves being hunted by fresh American pilots in superior aircraft while their own fuel supplies shrank and their own mechanics struggled to keep worn engines running with replacement parts that arrived weeks late or not at all. The most revealing document in the entire history of the air war over Europe is not a battle report. It is a letter. In January 1944, Hermann Göring assembled his senior fighter commanders for a conference at Karenhall, his elaborate hunting estate north of Berlin. He had just been informed that American fighter escorts had been seen over Aachen, a city deep in western Germany that Göring had assured Hitler no American fighter could reach. His response to his commanders reflected the depth of his refusal to engage with facts. He told them the sightings were impossible. He told them the pilots were mistaken. He told them that American long-range fighters did not exist and that anyone who claimed to have seen one was either lying or had been deceived by a British aircraft. The fighter commanders around the table knew exactly what they had been fighting over Germany for the previous 2 months. General Galland told Göring directly that the aircraft existed, that it outperformed the Focke-Wulf 190 at high altitude, and that German pilots were losing engagements against it with regularity. Göring's documented response was to tell Galland that if American long-range fighters appeared in official reports, he would have those reports altered. He preferred the comfort of false data to the discomfort of accurate information. This was not a private conversation between two disappointed men. It was a strategic decision made at the highest level of German Air Force command that the reality of American capabilities would be officially denied. The pilots who had to face those capabilities every morning at 30,000 feet over German cities were given no new tactics, no new aircraft, and no acknowledgement that the world had changed. They were simply told to continue fighting the war as it had been briefed to them, against an enemy that no longer existed in the form they had been briefed to expect. The human cost of this denial fell on young men on both sides of the fight. American bomber crews who flew through 1943 and into 1944 did so knowing the odds were terrible and choosing to fly anyway, because the alternative was to let someone else take the mission and carry that knowledge forever. German fighter pilots who had spent years becoming extraordinary at something that was no longer survivable kept climbing to altitude because their duty was to defend German cities and German civilians, and they had sworn to do exactly that. Walter Esau was one of the Luftwaffe's most accomplished aces. He had 123 victories. He had served on every major front. By early 1944 he was commanding Jagdgeschwader II and writing letters to his wife that his fellow pilots, who read them after his death, described as those of a man who understood completely what was happening and could not stop it. He was shot down and killed on May 11, 1944, over the Eifel region, at the age of 30, during a mission to intercept a PV-38 fighter sweep. His final radio transmission, recorded by his ground controller, was a single German sentence that translates roughly as, "I cannot do any more." He was not referring to the mission. His fellow pilots understood that clearly. He was describing a calculation that every Luftwaffe fighter pilot who survived the war would eventually have to make privately, the moment when they understood that their skill and their courage and their experience had become irrelevant in the face of what they were actually fighting. The final months of the air war produced encounters that German pilots described in post-war interviews with something between bafflement and admiration. American escort pilots by 1944 were not the inexperienced volunteers of 1942, and American tactics had evolved to match German countermeasures with a speed and systematization that German units struggled to replicate. When Luftwaffe commanders developed new attack profiles, American intelligence often intercepted radio traffic describing them within days, analyzed the approach, and distributed counter-tactics to escort squadrons before the new German method could be employed more than a handful of times. The feedback loop between American intelligence, training, and tactical adaptation ran faster than the German equivalent, partly because American aircraft production was not being bombed and German aircraft production was, partly because American pilot training could be adjusted quickly based on actual combat reports and German pilot training was shortening under the pressure of losses rather than improving, and partly because American organizational culture treated failures as problems to be solved rather than facts to be denied. A P-51 group that lost 3 aircraft to a particular German attack profile would file a combat report that afternoon. The report would be analyzed within 48 hours. A revised training brief would reach other P-51 groups within a week. The German pilots who had developed the attack profile would find that it stopped working before they had used it enough to understand why it had worked initially. They were not outflown. They were out-institutionalized, which is a more complete and more permanent form of defeat. By the spring of 1945, when American ground forces crossed the Rhine and began driving into the heart of Germany, the Luftwaffe fighter force that had once shot down 60 American bombers in a single afternoon had been reduced to flying from emergency airstrips camouflaged under trees, rationing fuel that arrived in horse-drawn wagons because the roads and railways had been cut, and sending pilots into combat who had fewer hours of flight time than the men they were hunting had spent practicing aerial gunnery. The pilots who had accumulated the Great Aces tallies of 100 victories, 150, 200, were almost all gone, most of them dead, a few of them in hospitals, 1 or 2 of them prisoners of war who sat in camps watching American aircraft fly overhead in formations they no longer had the ability to count. The aircraft factories in Regensburg and Wiener Neustadt and Augsburg that had once produced Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs by the hundreds had been bombed so many times that their machine tools sat in pits of rubble under collapsed roofs, attended by workers who had nowhere to work and no raw materials to work with even if the buildings had been standing. The extraordinary industrial machine of the Third Reich, which Göring had insisted in 1942 could outproduce anything the Americans might attempt, had been strangled from the air by an enemy that Göring had also insisted would tire of the effort before it succeeded. Egon Mayer's report from November 1942, the one that first warned German Fighter Command that American bombers were more dangerous than anything they had previously encountered, had been correct in every particular except the conclusion that it implied. The conclusion most of his readers drew was that Germany needed better attack tactics. The conclusion that the evidence actually supported was that Germany faced an enemy whose resources made tactical superiority a temporary advantage at best and a false comfort at worst. Mayer himself, to his credit, understood this. He spent the last year of his life trying to develop tactics that would compensate for an industrial gap he had personally witnessed and privately believed was unbridgeable. His mechanics, who had watched him taxi onto the runway that grey November morning with the confidence of a man who expected to come back for lunch, watched his Focke-Wulf diminish to a speck over the Bay of Biscay and then come back with a damaged engine and a pilot who landed without the usual crispness, taxied to the revetment in silence, and climbed out of the cockpit without the usual debrief banter. What he had seen in the sky over the Atlantic that morning had settled something in him that the next 16 months of combat never quite unsettled. He had found the enemy's ceiling and there was no ceiling. He had measured the enemy's determination and it had no far edge. He had shot down American bombers and watched the formations close the gaps and continue on their way to the target as if the aircraft he had destroyed had never existed. That is what he could not explain in his report, the part that no classified assessment could quite capture. Not the guns or the armor or the formation discipline or the tactical doctrine. The thing that was actually different. The Americans kept coming. They kept coming because there were always more of them, because their industry built replacements faster than their losses accumulated, because their training pipelines filled the cockpits of new aircraft before the ink was dry on the casualty reports, because someone in a factory in Seattle or Wichita or Marietta had decided that winning this war was not a military objective or a political calculation but a personal matter, and had worked an extra shift to prove it. That is what Egon Mayer fought. That is what the Luftwaffe could never defeat. Not the men in the cockpits, though the men in the cockpits were brave enough. The system that put them there, and kept putting more of them there, every morning, regardless of what had happened the morning before. If you found value in this story, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us bring more forgotten history to people who care about getting it right. Subscribe to stay with us. Our community spans the globe, from veterans to historians to people who simply believe these stories deserve to be remembered. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. We read every one. Thank you for being here, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.